Have you ever opened your mailbox and felt your heart skip a beat when seeing a fancy envelope with your name printed beautifully on it? That was me on a chilly morning in early April. My name is Jessica Collins, and I've always thought that family is supposed to be the safe harbor where you're accepted no matter what, where your mistakes are forgiven and your presence is celebrated. But life doesn't always match up with what we imagine, does it? I grew up as the youngest child, always trying to catch up, always hoping to be seen. But for some reason, I often felt invisible, like a shadow moving quietly in the background of someone else's story. My older brother Alex was the golden child, the star everyone naturally gravitated toward. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the helper, the peacemaker, always giving, always waiting to be noticed. Yet year after year, event after event, I was left out forgotten like an afterthought. Still, I clung desperately to the hope that one day things would change. And then came that morning, the morning I found the invitation elegant and inviting, shimmering with gold letters. It read, "You are cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of Alex Collins and Emily Hart, set for May 20th. My heart soared with joy. Could this finally be it? The moment my family opened their eyes and saw me clearly for the first time. Little did I know that this invitation, this piece of paper that promised belonging and acceptance, was not at all what it seemed. It was about to lead me down a path I never expected, a journey through heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately an empowering discovery of who I truly am. If you've ever struggled to find your place, if you've ever questioned your worth among the very people who should cherish you, then this story is for you. Because sometimes the greatest gift we can receive from others isn't their acceptance, it's clarity. And clarity can change your life forever. Let me take you back to that moment, the invitation, the anticipation, and how my journey began. It's funny how a single envelope can hold so much hope inside. As I turned the invitation over in my hands, I felt a familiar ache, a strange cocktail of excitement and anxiety. For as long as I can remember, family gatherings had always left me with questions. Why was I the one cousin left out of summer road trips? Why did my birthday feel like an afterthought while Alex's was a full production with banners and backyard tents? I told myself these were harmless oversights, that maybe I just slipped through the cracks. My parents, Linda and Mark, would wave away my feelings. You know how busy things get, while my brother would shrug as if to say, that's just how it is. Each time I swallowed my disappointment and tried harder, volunteering for errands, showing up early, always ready to help. I became the useful one, hoping my usefulness would turn into belonging. It's a pattern I've seen in so many people around me. My friend Mariah once confided that she'd spent years baking birthday cakes for her siblings, only to get a store-bought cupcake for her own. We shared a laugh, but beneath it was a kind of silent heartbreak, a question we never dared to ask out loud. What if being useful is never enough? I began to notice this pattern everywhere, in friends who gave endlessly to partners who barely noticed, and coworkers who stayed late, hoping for a nod of appreciation. It's easy to believe that if we just give a little more, the people around us will finally see us, finally make space for us. But sometimes, no matter how brightly we try to shine, we can't force others to open their eyes. The lesson I learned slowly and painfully was that hope can be blinding when it's built on denial. I clung to every small gesture, every maybe next time, because I wanted to believe my family would eventually include me. But hope without honesty becomes a trap. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to face the truth, even when it hurts. As I stared at Alex's wedding invitation, I felt a cautious optimism rising inside me. Could this be the turning point? Maybe, just maybe this time, they really did want me there. Not as an obligation, but as family. With that thought, I began planning the perfect gift, the perfect dress, everything that might finally make me visible. And so, heart-brimming with hope, I called the one person who'd always made me feel seen, my Aunt Margaret. Little did I know my journey to the wedding would be nothing like I'd imagined. It was only just beginning, and soon I would discover that true belonging doesn't always come in the package you expect. Sometimes it's what you do with disappointment that shapes who you become. And as I started searching for that perfect gift, I couldn't have known just how much my idea of family and of myself was about to change. Choosing a gift for Alex's wedding felt like standing on the edge of possibility, one careful step away from being welcomed in or quietly reminded once again of my place outside the circle. I wanted it to be perfect, something that would speak louder than words that would say, "I'm here, I care, and I'm proud to be your sister." I spent hours researching gifts online, combing through wedding registries, reading reviews, even asking friends for advice. Nothing felt quite right. I wanted it to feel personal, thoughtful, something only I would think to give. In the end, I decided on a handmade scrapbook, filled with photos from our childhood, old letters, ticket stubs from baseball games, birthday cards, and little notes we'd passed each other under the dinner table. I stayed up late for nights on end, sifting through boxes in my closet, reliving memories I thought I'd forgotten. Each page was a tribute to the bond we'd once shared, a bond I'd always hoped to revive. As I worked, my hands moved almost on their own, pasting in memories with careful precision while my heart wavered between nostalgia and longing. This wasn't just a wedding present. It was an offering, a piece of myself. I couldn't help but think of my Aunt Margaret as I worked, the one person who'd never failed to make me feel like I belonged. She had a way of showing up just when I needed her most, whether with a tin of homemade cookies or a gentle phone call on a lonely evening. Aunt Margaret was different from the rest of my family, softer around the edges, unafraid to ask real questions, to acknowledge what others seemed determined to ignore. Whenever I doubted myself, she'd remind me, "Jessica, you are enough. You don't have to earn a place at anyone's table." Her words were a balm, but in the quiet hours, my doubts always crept back in. A few days before the wedding, I called her. "Aunt Margaret, I just want this to be perfect. I want Alex to see how much he means to me, how much all of you mean to me." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of her breath steady and slow. "Jessie, gifts can be beautiful," she said, "but love isn't something you can wrap up and hand over. You deserve to be loved simply because you're you." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Deep down, I knew I was trying to fill a hole with ribbons and glue, hoping that this gesture, this one act of devotion, would finally shift something in the family that felt so unmovable. As I wrapped the scrapbook in gold paper, I thought of my friend Mariah again. She once told me about the year she spent all of her savings on a special anniversary gift for her parents, a weekend getaway complete with a handwritten itinerary and a video montage of family moments. Her parents thanked her politely, but spent most of the trip arguing, barely acknowledging her efforts. I thought I could fix things with the perfect gift, Mariah confessed later. But you can't wrap up love for people who refuse to open it. It's a lesson that sits quietly between the lines of so many family stories, a lesson I was only beginning to understand myself. Still, the ritual of preparation was comforting. I booked a hair appointment, found a dress that made me feel strong, and even splurged on a pair of silver earrings. There was an almost childlike hope bubbling up in me as the big day approached. I imagined the wedding as a kind of threshold, a moment that would mark the end of old disappointments and the start of something new. I pictured Alex's face when he saw the scrapbook, the hugs, the laughter, maybe even a few tears. I wanted so badly to be part of that joy. On the eve of the wedding, I packed everything carefully and drove over to Aunt Margaret's house, the scrapbook nestled on the passenger seat beside me. Her place always felt like a refuge, a small sunny kitchen smelling of lemon cake and tea windows filled with plants and afternoon light. I wanted to share my gift with her, to bask in her encouragement before facing the bigger, harder crowd. She greeted me at the door with a hug, her arms warm and steady, her eyes a little sadder than usual. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," she said, and for a moment I felt like everything really could be okay. But as we settled in for coffee, I noticed an unfamiliar photo album on the table, thick with glossy pages and bright, happy faces. When I asked her about it, she hesitated, her fingers trembling just slightly as she poured our tea. "It's from Alex's wedding," she said quietly. My heart froze. "But the wedding is tomorrow," I replied, my voice thin and uncertain. She shook her head. "No, darling, it was last weekend. I tried to call you, but I just didn't know how." The room seemed to shrink around me. The scrapbook in my bag felt suddenly heavy, almost foolish. In that moment, the truth I'd been avoiding came crashing in. It's hard to describe what it feels like to realize you've been excluded intentionally, methodically, by the people you most want to impress. I felt embarrassment, anger, sadness, and above all, a terrible, hollow sense of clarity. All those years of trying, all those maybe next times had led to this. I'd been holding on to hope, mistaking it for love. I saw it in Aunt Margaret's eyes, a mixture of guilt and compassion. And I understood that sometimes the people who love you the most are the ones who are brave enough to tell you the truth, even when it hurts. The lesson in that moment was hard but necessary. No gift, no gesture, no amount of effort can make someone see your value if they're determined to ignore it. Love, real love, isn't something you can earn with perfect wrapping or a carefully chosen card. It's given freely or not at all. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is recognize when your gifts are being wasted, when your energy and care deserve to be redirected somewhere they're truly seen. Aunt Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You're stronger than you think, Jessica. You don't have to go through this alone, but you also don't have to keep showing up for people who won't show up for you. Her words landed somewhere deep in my chest, heavier than any scrapbook, and I realized the journey I'd imagined, the reconciliation, the celebration wasn't going to happen. At least not the way I'd planned. Yet sitting in that sunlit kitchen with tears threatening and the quiet ache of disappointment in my bones, I found a flicker of something else, a kind of relief. Maybe this was the ending I needed so I could finally begin again. Sometimes we have to let go of old dreams to make room for something truer. As I hugged Aunt Margaret goodbye, I promised myself I'd stop chasing what couldn't be caught. I'd start looking for love and acceptance, not where I hoped they'd be, but where they really lived. With the scrapbook still unopened and my heart heavier but wiser, I walked out into the fading evening, not sure what would come next, but ready to find out. What I didn't know was that the hardest part of my journey was only just beginning, and soon I would have to face my family not as someone begging for a place at their table, but as someone finally willing to stand alone with dignity and truth on my side. Shock is a peculiar thing. It doesn't crash down all at once. It seeps in, slowly dulling the edges of everything familiar. After Aunt Margaret's confession, I sat there staring at the album-numb turning pages that felt like a record of someone else's life. There was Alex beaming beside Emily under a canopy of white blossoms. There were my parents, glasses-raised faces alight with the easy joy of a family united. Cousins, old neighbors, even people I barely recognized, all present, all smiling, all accounted for, all except me. I traced a finger over the edge of the page, almost expecting to find myself tucked away in the background, half hidden, but I was nowhere to be found. I thought about the hours I'd spent preparing, about the scrapbook on the passenger seat of my car, and felt the slow burn of humiliation climb up my neck. Aunt Margaret, her voice shaking with emotion, apologized again for not warning me sooner. I tried to speak up, Jess, she said, eyes shining with tears, but sometimes it's hard to be the only one who disagrees. I wish I'd been braver. I understood her position, how difficult it is to go against the grain, especially in families where silence is a currency. I remembered how years ago, a friend of mine, Ben, confided that his sister was left out of family holidays for reasons no one could quite explain. She lives just across town, he said, but it's like we've all agreed not to talk about her absence. At the time, I couldn't understand it. Now, sitting in my aunt's living room, I saw it with painful clarity. Sometimes people exclude not out of malice, but out of habit, out of fear of disrupting the false peace they've built. The truth as it dawned on me was less about the wedding and more about a long pattern of exclusion. The wedding was just the latest chapter in a story that had started long ago, a story where I was always an afterthought, where my needs were negotiable, where my presence was never truly desired. It hurt to admit, but I needed to see it. Denial had kept me hoping, but truth would set me free. My family, for reasons I may never fully understand, had decided I was easier to leave out than to include. Maybe I reminded them of something uncomfortable. Maybe I was simply too different. Whatever the reason, I realized that no amount of effort or good intentions on my part could rewrite a script they'd rehearsed for years. I took a deep breath and let the sadness wash over me. But I also felt a new kind of resolve stirring inside. I remembered something a therapist once told me. It's better to be hurt by the truth than comforted by a lie. It was time to stop making excuses for others and start being honest with myself. I didn't deserve to be left out, no matter how quietly or politely it was done. I decided right then that I would confront my family not in anger, but in search of answers. I needed to hear them say it to know whether my absence was an accident or a choice. Later that evening, I drove home, my thoughts swirling with questions and possible conversations. The city lights blurred past my window as I rehearsed what I would say. Would my parents try to explain it away as they always did? Would Alex finally admit to what he'd never spoken aloud? There's a kind of bravery in seeking the truth, even when you suspect it will hurt. I thought of Ben's sister again, how she eventually stopped asking, how she built her own community out of friends and neighbors who welcomed her without condition. Maybe I realized that was the real lesson here. When the people who should love you turn away, you have every right to build a new home, a new family from the ground up. When I finally made it back to my apartment, the scrapbook still wrapped in gold paper, I sat quietly in the dark, letting myself feel everything: the grief, the anger, the betrayal, and beneath it all the glimmer of freedom that comes with knowing you are no longer waiting for an invitation. For the first time in years, I stopped blaming myself. I stopped making excuses for them. Sometimes love isn't about what you can do for others, but about what you refuse to do to yourself, like settling for less than you deserve. As the night wore on, my resolve grew stronger. I decided I would visit my parents the next day, not as the daughter desperately seeking approval, but as a woman worthy of honesty and respect. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Families have a way of turning every confrontation into an old familiar dance. But I was done tiptoeing around the truth. I was done being silent to keep the peace. The lesson, stark and simple, was this: pretending not to see a problem never solves it. Sometimes facing the uncomfortable truth is the only way to find a path forward. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I dressed simply, gathered my thoughts, and headed to my parents' house, heart pounding but steady. I didn't know what answers I would get, or whether I would get any at all. But I knew that whatever happened, I was no longer powerless. My voice mattered even if it shook. And as I walked up the familiar stone path to their door, I felt the first glimmers of something new. Not just loss, but possibility. Because sometimes the act of asking why is the first step toward finding your own where next. And so I raised my hand and knocked, ready at last to face the truth, even if it wasn't the one I wanted. Little did I know that conversation would change everything, not just my relationship with my family, but my understanding of myself. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. The morning air was thick with that particular silence you only feel before a difficult conversation. As I walked up my parents' front steps, I remembered childhood mornings spent here, Sunday pancakes spilled, orange juice, laughter echoing in the kitchen. Funny how the same door that once meant comfort could now feel so heavy to open. I clutched the gold-wrapped scrapbook, no longer a gift, but a symbol of everything I'd carried quietly for years. My fingers hovered at the doorbell as I tried to steady my breath. This time, I wasn't coming to make peace. I was coming to seek the truth. When my mother opened the door, she looked surprised. Her smile, a reflex, not a welcome. "Jessica, we weren't expecting you." Her words danced between confusion and discomfort. My father glanced up from the living room, his expression unreadable. I walked in my feet, almost knowing the path from habit, but my heart felt like it belonged to someone else. "Can we talk?" I asked, keeping my voice soft but steady. We settled into the kitchen, the air awkward, my parents exchanging silent looks. I set the scrapbook on the table between us, not as an offering, but as a quiet witness. "I know about the wedding," I said gently. "Aunt Margaret told me. I saw the photos. The truth hung between us, too large to ignore." My mother's lips tightened. My father looked away. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Alex's name came up, and the room changed. "Your brother?" My mother began, then stopped. "He thought it would be easier," my father finished, "if you didn't come." The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were finally out in the open. The explanations came in a trickle: that my presence made things unpredictable, that I was too sensitive, that I always needed something different. They didn't say it with anger, but with a weary resignation, as if they were reciting a list of inconveniences. It was strange to hear my life reduced to a series of disruptions rather than all the times I'd tried to make things right. "You've always been hard to read," my mother said, her voice trembling. "We just wanted a simple day." I looked at the two people who'd raised me and wondered how we could live in the same house for years and end up strangers. I've learned this is not uncommon. Years ago, a friend named Michael told me his family called him the difficult one because he was the first to go to therapy and talk about feelings. They said I ruined Christmas with my honesty. He laughed bitterly. "Turns out nobody likes the mirror you hold up if it makes them uncomfortable." Sometimes families push away what they can't control or don't want to face. For me, hearing it out loud hurt, but there was relief in finally knowing the real reason. They weren't indifferent. They were afraid of change, of the discomfort that comes with facing old wounds. I felt tears threatening, but kept my voice steady. I spent a long time thinking if I just worked harder, was more helpful, less needy, things would change. But it's not my job to make everyone comfortable at the cost of my own happiness. The room fell silent. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in my mother's eyes. My father shifted as if he wanted to say something, but didn't have the words. In that moment, I understood something vital. Sometimes no explanation will satisfy your heart. You can search for reasons for apologies, but the only real closure comes from accepting the truth and letting go. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Confrontation doesn't always bring resolution, but it does bring clarity. When you ask difficult questions and receive painful answers, you finally see what you're working with. I left my parents' house feeling raw but free. The door closed behind me with a finality that echoed through my bones. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was sad for the family we could have been, but grateful to know I no longer needed to chase approval where it would never be found. Driving home, the city blurred by a gentle rain starting to fall. I thought about all the energy I'd spent trying to belong, the late nights spent making things just right, the careful ways I'd tiptoed around everyone's feelings. The relief was real. I was done. I could stop performing for an audience that never really wanted to see me. From now on, my life would be mine, not a role I was cast into, but a story I could write for myself. But clarity brings new challenges too. Once you know the truth, you have to decide what to do with it. The next steps were daunting. Setting boundaries, learning to say no, and figuring out how to move forward without the approval I'd always sought. I knew some people would judge me and others wouldn't understand. But I also knew I deserved better than being a ghost at my own family's table. With the confrontation behind me, I realized I had the power to choose what came next. I thought of Aunt Margaret's kitchen, her gentle reassurance that I was enough. That memory gave me the strength to imagine a different future. As the rain tapered off and the sun broke through the clouds, I promised myself to protect my peace, even if it meant walking a new and unfamiliar path. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be honest. I would learn to draw boundaries not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And as I turned down my street, the gold-wrapped scrapbook still unopened beside me, I felt a quiet sense of possibility. Sometimes the hardest conversations set you free. Next came the challenge of standing firm in my decisions, even as old patterns tried to pull me back. Setting boundaries is never easy, especially with people who taught you to put their comfort before your own. But as I would soon discover, protecting yourself isn't just an act of self-preservation, it's a declaration of worth, and it's the first real step toward healing. In the days that followed my conversation with my parents, a gentle quietness settled over my life. At first, it felt almost unnatural, like the hush after a long storm. I went through the motions of my routines, but my mind kept circling back to everything that had been said and unsaid around that kitchen table. There's a strange emptiness when you finally stop hoping for things to change, a kind of silence that fills the space where old longing used to live. Yet within that silence, I found a sliver of peace. I no longer had to twist myself into knots, no longer had to edit my words or mute my feelings to make everyone else comfortable. Still, as I sat with the truth, I realized there was one more step I needed to take, one that would truly set me free. You see, for years, I'd quietly supported my parents in ways they never fully acknowledged. Whenever the roof leaked or the furnace gave out, I'd step in using the savings from my job in digital marketing to keep their home running. I never expected praise, and I certainly never wanted my help to feel like leverage. It was simply what I did, one more invisible act of service in a long line of unseen gestures. But now, after everything, I began to question whether my ongoing support was truly kindness, or if it had become another thread, binding me to a family dynamic that only brought pain. One evening, I sat with Aunt Margaret over cups of chamomile tea, letting my worries spill out. She listened carefully as she always did, and then asked me something that stopped me in my tracks. "Jessica, if you stopped helping, would your parents even notice it was you?" The question echoed in my mind long after I'd gone home. I realized that sometimes the things we do to prove our worth end up keeping us trapped in old patterns. I thought about the countless people I'd met in support groups over the years, women and men who gave until they were empty, hoping that generosity would buy love that never came. Their stories were hauntingly familiar. The daughter who co-signed loans for a parent who never said thank you. The son who moved home to care for an ailing father who still preferred his absent brother. That night, I made a decision. I would quietly close the accounts I used to pay my parents' bills. I would no longer arrange for repairs or cover taxes on the house. If I was truly going to break free, I needed to cut the cord that kept me bound to their approval. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the energy I'd poured into a well that never filled. I'd learned finally that love isn't supposed to hurt and care isn't supposed to cost you your sense of self. When I told my attorney, Ms. Benson, about my decision, she nodded with understanding. You're not abandoning them, Jessica. You're choosing yourself. We talked through the details, making sure everything was above board, and I felt a cautious strength building inside. The next day, I made the necessary calls, sent the emails, and sat quietly as the last payment cleared from my account. There was no anger, no ceremony, just a gentle release, like letting go of a bird I'd kept in a cage far too long. As the days turned into weeks, the impact of my decision rippled through my life in subtle ways. I had more time, more energy, and a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I poured that energy into my work, taking on new projects and mentoring younger colleagues who reminded me what it felt like to be seen for your strengths, not your sacrifices. I reached out to friends I'd neglected and started volunteering at a local animal shelter, finding joy in places where my presence made a real difference. The lesson in all of this was simple, but profound. Giving is beautiful, but only when it's balanced with self-respect. Generosity without boundaries turns into self-neglect. I wish I'd learned it sooner, but I'm grateful I learned it at all. I thought again of Mariah, my friend, who once told me she'd stopped baking cakes for everyone else and finally made one for herself on her birthday. It was the best cake I ever tasted, she laughed. There's a special kind of sweetness in choosing yourself, something I was only just beginning to savor. But change doesn't happen in a vacuum. My decision set off a chain of events I could never have predicted. My parents called in confusion when the next utility bill arrived unpaid, their voices tight and bewildered. At first, I answered gently, reminding them they'd need to take care of things themselves. The conversations were short and strained, but I didn't waver. With each interaction, I felt my confidence grow. It's never easy to redraw the lines in relationships that have gone unchallenged for years. Yet every time I chose not to step in, I was also choosing my own healing. As the days passed, I knew I would face new challenges, ones that required me to protect my boundaries in the face of pressure and guilt. But for the first time, I was ready. I wasn't seeking to punish anyone. I was simply making room for a life where I mattered just as much as anyone else. Sometimes we must give up the role of caretaker to finally take care of ourselves. The next chapter would test me in new ways, emotionally and legally. I knew there would be difficult conversations and perhaps even pushback from those who didn't understand my choices. But I'd built the courage to stand firm. And as I stepped out into the world, no longer carrying the burden of everyone else's happiness, I felt a quiet hope bloom inside me. Now it was time to put my boundaries into action and learn what it really meant to stand up for myself, not out of anger or hurt, but out of love and deep respect for the person I was becoming. The journey was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. There's something profoundly empowering about learning to set boundaries, even though the first steps can feel terrifying. As I watched the last of my automatic payments to my parents' home fade into digital oblivion, a sense of possibility settled in. But there was still a question gnawing at me late into the night. What would happen if my family refused to respect the distance I needed? In the past, every attempt I made to pull back was met with guilt pressure or a sudden crisis that only I could fix. I'd always backed down, afraid that saying no would mean losing what little connection remained. This time, however, I was determined to protect my peace at any cost. That resolve was tested almost immediately. Within days, I started getting calls and messages, first confused, then angry, finally desperate. My mother's voice on the phone sounded strained. Jessica, why are you shutting us out? We're family. My father left voicemails reminding me of everything they'd done for me, asking how I could be so cold. Each time the words tugged at old wounds, tempting me to cave. But with every message, I reminded myself, boundaries aren't punishments. They're acts of self-care. It's not about shutting people out. It's about inviting myself in. I turned to my attorney, Ms. Benson, for advice. After explaining my history with my parents, she listened quietly and then suggested a step I'd never seriously considered: before a formal restraining order if harassment continued. At first, the idea seemed drastic, almost unthinkable. How could I take legal action against the people who raised me? But as we discussed my options, I realized that sometimes the only way to enforce your boundaries is to make them visible and non-negotiable. Ms. Benson explained that emotional abuse, repeated unwanted contact, and manipulation are all forms of harm, no less real, because they come from family. I remembered a story from a support group I'd attended, a woman named Leah, who, after years of emotional manipulation from her siblings, finally filed for a protective order. I kept thinking I was making a big deal out of nothing Leah told us. But the moment I stood up for myself, I felt like I could finally breathe. Her courage inspired me, as did her reminder that seeking help doesn't make you weak, it means you're taking yourself seriously for the first time. I realized then that so many of us, especially women, are taught to endure discomfort rather than rock the boat. We stay silent, hoping things will get better, but silence only feeds the cycle. With Ms. Benson's help, I began gathering evidence, text messages, voicemails, email threads, every time I'd been pressured, manipulated, or made to feel less than whole. It was uncomfortable, even painful to review years of digital history. But with every screenshot, I grew a little stronger. I saw the patterns more clearly, the guilt, the gaslighting, the subtle reminders that my role was always to give and forgive. As we filed the paperwork, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Would my parents be angry? Would they see this as the ultimate betrayal? Maybe. But for once, I knew I was making the right choice for me. The lesson that surfaced was both simple and radical. Boundaries are not just personal, they can be legal too. In a culture that celebrates family above all else, it can feel taboo to involve the law. But true respect means honoring someone's no, whether it's spoken quietly or enforced in a courtroom. We have a right to protect our mental and emotional safety just as much as our physical well-being. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that love alone isn't enough to keep you safe. As the restraining order was approved and delivered, I felt the weight lift. There was sadness, of course, but there was also an emerging sense of pride. I wasn't powerless. I had found a way to stand tall without burning myself out. I thought about Leah, about Aunt Margaret's steady belief in me, about all the people I'd met who quietly survived their families by learning to draw a line in the sand. We're taught that love means never giving up. But sometimes true love is choosing yourself, especially when no one else will. Still, life isn't a fairy tale. The legal paperwork brought on a new wave of reactions, some expected, some not. My parents tried to contact me through friends and relatives, hoping someone would convince me to lift the order. There were moments when I questioned myself, when the loneliness felt sharp and the old guilt crept back in. But I stayed the course, drawing strength from the small community I'd built, the friends who checked in, the therapist who reminded me that self-respect is never selfish, and the gentle certainty that comes from surviving the worst storms. This new chapter would bring more tests, more hard conversations and decisions about the future of the family home, decisions that would require not just legal boundaries, but emotional clarity and resilience. For the first time, I felt ready. The law had drawn a line, but my heart had drawn an even stronger one. I was no longer defined by what I tolerated, but by what I protected. Now, with boundaries in place and a new sense of agency, I turned my attention to the family home, a symbol of the past, but also of unfinished business. What would happen when kindness was mistaken for weakness? One too many times, I was about to find out. And as the sun rose on that new day, I knew this was not the end, but a new beginning, when I had chosen one that finally belonged to me. With the restraining order in place and a line finally drawn between me and the cycle of hurt, there remained one last thread, connecting me to the past, the family home. For years, my parents had lived in the house that was legally mine. I had quietly purchased the mortgage years ago to keep them from losing it when they hit financial trouble, a decision made from compassion and hope, not power. I never used it as leverage, never asked for gratitude. It was simply one more way to keep my family afloat, to preserve what little peace there was. But now, after everything that had happened, I realized that as long as they stayed there, I was still bound to the past, still responsible for their comfort, even as they disregarded my boundaries. One afternoon, I met with my attorney, Ms. Benson, in her quiet, sunlit office. She laid out the facts with clarity and patience. "Jessica, you have every legal right to reclaim the property," she said. "You've already made more sacrifices than most." Her words held no judgment, only recognition of a reality I had tried hard to avoid. I hesitated. Was I ready to take this step? I thought of friends who'd shared similar experiences. A colleague whose brother squatted in her late mother's house for years, refusing to move out and poisoning every family gathering with resentment. "The house became a battleground," she told me once, and I realized I'd rather have peace than a place to visit on holidays. Her honesty stuck with me. The process was strangely formal for something so deeply personal. Paperwork notices, timelines, legal steps to undo years of emotional entanglement. I drafted an official eviction notice, tears stinging my eyes as I signed my name. It felt final but necessary. I knew my parents would see this as the ultimate betrayal, another reason to label me as ungrateful or cold. but I also knew that keeping the house for them had only prolonged the pain for both sides. Sometimes mercy looks like letting go, even if it's misunderstood. When the day came to deliver the notice, I asked Aunt Margaret to be with me. Her steady presence was a balm against the fear in my chest. We drove together in silence, watching autumn leaves scatter across the familiar streets of my childhood. My father answered the door, older and smaller than I remembered, and for a moment I saw him not as an adversary, but as a man burdened by his own mistakes. "Dad, I need to talk to you," I said gently. He listened as I explained the situation, my reasons, my need for closure, my desire for both of us to move forward. My mother appeared, her face shadowed with disbelief. "You're kicking us out," she asked, her voice trembling between anger and grief. I explained as kindly as I could. "This isn't about punishment. It's about moving on. I need to reclaim my life, and this home is part of that." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. There were tears and accusations, but I remained calm. I remembered what my therapist once said: guilt is not proof of wrongdoing. It's often just a sign you're breaking an old pattern. I clung to that wisdom as my parents pleaded and bargained, promising to change, reminding me of everything I owed them. The hardest part was knowing that compassion doesn't always mean compliance. A few weeks later, my parents left the house quietly, taking only what they needed. There was no dramatic scene, just a quiet sadness that settled in the empty rooms. I walked through each space: the kitchen, where I learned to bake, the living room, where family photos once hung, the bedroom that had been mine as a child. It was bittersweet letting go of a place that held so many memories, both joyful and painful. I kept a few mementos: a faded photo, a pressed flower from my mother's old garden, and locked the door behind me, feeling the weight of finality and relief in equal measure. The lesson I learned through all of this was simple, though it took years to fully understand. Sometimes the greatest kindness you can give yourself is permission to close a chapter that no longer serves you. Holding on for the sake of tradition or obligation only deepens old wounds. Releasing the past, even when it hurts, makes space for healing and possibility. I thought of my colleague's words again, how she found peace, not by winning, but by letting go. With the house sold and the ties to my old role finally severed, I felt a strange freedom, an openness to whatever might come next. There was grief, yes, but also a hopefulness I hadn't felt in years. The journey was far from over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. I knew there would be consequences, that my parents and brother might never understand my choices. But I was learning that understanding is not a prerequisite for self-respect. As I stepped out into the autumn air, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, I carried with me the knowledge that real strength comes not from clinging to the past, but from having the courage to start again. My story was now my own to write, untethered from old expectations. In the next chapter, I would discover how the consequences of these decisions rippled outward, not just for me, but for everyone involved. True freedom comes with new challenges, but also with the opportunity to finally live in alignment with your own values. And as the days grew colder and the world outside turned toward winter, I found myself ready to embrace the unknown, one honest step at a time. In the weeks after my parents left the house, life grew strangely quiet. The phone stopped ringing. My inbox was empty, save for the gentle check-ins from Aunt Margaret or the occasional message from colleagues. I thought I'd feel relief, and I did, but there was also an unexpected emptiness, a silence that echoed in the corners of my new apartment. The boundaries I had so bravely drawn brought freedom, but they also carved out space where old connections used to be. Sometimes I found myself reaching for my phone to share a piece of good news, only to realize I didn't know who to call. It's a strange thing, mourning a relationship that was more hope than reality. As the days passed, I focused on building new routines. I poured my energy into work, finding satisfaction in the creative freedom and respect I'd worked so hard to earn. My team grew, and for the first time, I felt truly seen for my strengths. I reconnected with friends who had patiently waited through years of my family's drama, discovering that chosen family can be just as powerful and sometimes even more nurturing than the one you're born into. One afternoon, my friend Mariah invited me over to celebrate her birthday. Surrounded by laughter, homemade cake, and people who knew her value, I realized how different life could feel when you are loved for who you are, not for the roles you play. But healing isn't always a straight line. There were days when regret and guilt would sneak in, whispering that maybe I had gone too far, that perhaps forgiveness would have been the easier path. On one of those evenings, I attended a support group where a woman named Tara spoke about standing up to her controlling parents. I lost them. At least for now, Tara said, her voice steady, but I found myself. And that's a trait I can live with. Her story resonated deeply with me, reminding me that sometimes the most important work we do is the work of becoming our own person, even if it comes at the cost of connection. Of course, the consequences of my decisions didn't just affect me. Word traveled quickly through our small community. Some relatives reached out surprised or judgmental, while others stayed silent, uncomfortable with the family drama. I heard that my parents had moved into a modest apartment across town and that my father picked up a part-time job at a hardware store. My mother found work at a senior care facility. There was no grand reconciliation, but I hoped that, in their own way, they were learning to build something new from the ground up. Alex, my brother, had his own troubles. His marriage faltered under the pressure of family secrets, and eventually Emily left him. It was as if the whole structure had finally collapsed, revealing all the cracks that had been papered over for years. Despite everything, I found it in my heart to wish them well from a distance. I no longer felt responsible for fixing what I didn't break or for holding together a family that had let me go. There's a quiet dignity in letting people face the consequences of their actions just as you accept your own. For years, I had absorbed every slight, every burden, hoping that if I tried hard enough, loved hard enough, I could change the ending. The truth, as it turns out, is both simpler and harder. You can't save people from themselves. The lesson that crystallized for me in those months was this: boundaries are not walls. They are doors you choose to open or close. And real love is not about erasing yourself to fit someone else's needs. It's about showing up honestly and fully for your own life. I saw how easy it is to fall into the trap of rescuing others and how liberating it is to let go. We are each responsible for the lives we create. Sometimes that means facing hard truths and allowing others to do the same. Winter arrived, slowly blanketing the city in quiet white. I took walks in the early morning, watching my breath cloud the air, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of my own footsteps. With every day that passed, the ache of loss softened, replaced by a deeper sense of peace. I began to imagine a future not defined by old wounds, but by the new choices I could make. The support group became a safe haven, a circle of people who understood that healing is not about pretending everything is fine, but about building something better one day at a time. As I moved through the season, I noticed a subtle but profound shift. The guilt that once kept me tethered to the past lost its power. In its place grew gratitude for my own resilience, for the kindness of friends, for the quiet wisdom of Aunt Margaret, who never once judged me for choosing myself. I learned to forgive not for their sake, but for mine, so I could keep moving forward unburdened. Yet even in this newfound peace, life had more lessons in store. The consequences of my choices would bring new challenges, unexpected encounters, letters in the mail, moments that tested the boundaries I had so carefully set. But I was stronger now, more sure of who I was and what I deserved. The next chapter would be about facing these moments with grace and conviction, trusting that every ending is also a beginning. And so, as the new year approached, I stood by my window watching the snow fall, a cup of tea warming my hands. The past was behind me, but the story was far from over. There would be new conversations, new reckonings, and perhaps even the possibility of forgiveness, not as surrender, but as a gift I could give myself. With hope and courage, I was ready to see what would come next. It was deep in winter when the first letter arrived, addressed in my father's familiar handwriting. For a long time, I hesitated before opening it, the envelope heavy in my hands with the weight of things unsaid. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to keep the peace I had worked so hard to build. But curiosity and a quiet, enduring love won out. Inside the letter was surprisingly simple. My father wrote about their new life, the modest apartment, his job at the hardware store, and my mother's days at the care facility. The words were careful, even humble, tinged with a regret that felt new, or at least newly acknowledged. I wish I had listened more, spoken less, he wrote. I see now how much I failed you. His words touched something old and aching in me, but I let myself just sit with the feeling, not rushing to respond. Over the next few weeks, more letters came, each one softer, more open. My father wrote about his memories from my childhood ice cream, on the front steps building a treehouse together, the things he wished he'd cherished instead of overlooking. There were no sweeping apologies, just small, honest admissions. I thought about Tara from support group, who told us once about reconnecting with her estranged brother. It took years before we said anything real, she shared, but we started with postcards, then emails, then coffee. Forgiveness wasn't an event, it was a process. Her story gave me permission to move slowly, to let healing come in its own time, not out of pressure, but out of truth. My mother, too, eventually reached out. Her note was more tentative, as if unsure she was allowed to write at all. She wrote about her work, the people she cared for, how she'd begun to see the world with new eyes. There was a gentle humility in her words, a sense that she was learning to take responsibility for herself in ways she never had before. She didn't ask for money or help or even forgiveness. She simply wanted me to know she was thinking of me. For the first time, I could see her not as the all-powerful figure of my childhood, but as a woman with her own regrets and limitations. The distance had given us both the space to see each other more clearly. Still, forgiveness was not easy or automatic. There were days I wanted to write back to bridge the gap with a single letter, and days I needed to stay silent, protecting the new life I had built. I realized that forgiveness for me wasn't about erasing the past or pretending everything was okay. It was about making peace with what had happened and deciding how much, if any, I wanted to let these relationships back into my life. I remembered something Aunt Margaret once told me: forgiveness is not letting someone off the hook. It's setting yourself free from the story. That wisdom became my anchor. I found that this period of uncertainty was shared by others too. My friend Mariah had been through a similar journey with her estranged mother. At first, I wanted a big apology, something dramatic she admitted one day over coffee. But what helped most was watching her change little by little. That's how I knew she meant it. Their story reminded me that people don't always change all at once. Sometimes growth comes in small, almost invisible increments, and sometimes that's enough to open the door a crack. Throughout it all, I stayed close to the boundaries I'd set. I replied to some letters carefully, honestly, letting myself acknowledge both the hurt and the hope. I found myself wishing for good things for my parents, even as I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. There was a dignity in that, a way of loving from afar without losing myself. As spring approached, I felt a growing sense of peace, a feeling that the past had lost its power to wound me, and the future was no longer something I feared. The lesson in these quiet exchanges was simple, but profound. Forgiveness is an act of self-compassion, not surrender. It means letting go of the hope for a better past and embracing the imperfect present with all its pain and possibility. I learned to see my parents not just as the source of old wounds, but as people on their own journey stumbling toward understanding just as I was. And in doing so, I found myself growing lighter, less defined by what I'd lost, and more open to what I could still gain. As the world thawed and the first buds of spring appeared, I knew my story was turning a page. Forgiveness didn't erase the consequences of the past, but it did give me permission to move forward with boundaries, with hope, and with a deeper faith in my own resilience. I had learned that healing is not something you wait for from others. It's a gift you give yourself again and again. And so with the soft light of a new season filling my home, I prepared for what came next. A future not dictated by fear or regret, but by the quiet, steady promise of a life chosen on my own terms. The journey was almost complete, but the most important lesson was still waiting just around the corner. As spring deepened, so did my sense of possibility. The hard frost of old resentments finally began to melt, and in their place, I found fertile ground for something new. For the first time in years, I no longer defined myself by what I lacked: a family's approval, a brother's affection, a sense of belonging. Instead, I discovered the quiet joy of building a life on my own terms. I poured myself into work, not out of escape, but out of genuine pride in what I'd accomplished. I decorated my home with bright colors and fresh flowers, hosting dinners for friends who had become my chosen family. There was laughter at my table, the kind that filled the house from the inside out. One day, as I walked through the park, I saw a mother and daughter feeding ducks by the pond. They laughed easily, utterly at home with one another. For a fleeting moment, I felt the old ache, the longing for something simple, whole, and easy. But just as quickly, I realized that my life, though different from what I once imagined, was beautiful in its own way. It reminded me of Tara's story from group. "We can't rewrite the past," she said, "but we can write the next chapter." Her words echoed in my heart as I watched the pair, grateful for the journey I had taken, even the painful parts, because they had brought me here. Assume change. I learned rarely comes with fanfare or certainty. It arrives in small steps and quiet mornings, in the courage to say no when you need to, and yes, when your heart is ready. I watched as my parents continued to rebuild their lives from a distance, grateful for the humility and honesty that now colored our rare exchanges. Forgiveness didn't mean reopening every door, but it did mean letting go of anger. I wished them peace, and in doing so, I felt my own burdens lighten. There were moments when doubts crept in. Was I too harsh? Did I close the door too firmly? I remembered a conversation with Mariah, who had once said, "Self-respect isn't selfish. It's the foundation for everything else." She was right. Every choice I'd made, even the hardest ones, was an act of trust in my own worth. And as I learned to trust myself, I found that others did too. New friendships blossomed, rooted in authenticity and care. My world grew larger, brighter, full of possibility. Looking back, I saw that the journey was never just about leaving behind what hurt me. It was about moving toward what made me whole. The lesson I carried with me was clear. You can't control how others treat you, but you can always choose how you respond. Boundaries are not barriers to love, but bridges to a healthier, kinder relationship with yourself and others. We are all works in progress, deserving of patience, understanding, and a second chance, not just from those around us, but from ourselves. As the season changed and sunlight lingered in the evenings, I began to dream again of travel, of writing, of new adventures, yet to come. I found joy in simple things: a long walk, a homemade meal, the company of those who truly saw me. Life, I realized, is not defined by the absence of pain, but by the presence of hope and the willingness to try again. Each day became a small act of creation, a step further into a future I could finally claim as my own. The story I'd lived was not the one I would have written for myself, but in the rewriting, I found power, grace, and freedom. I knew there would be challenges ahead, moments when old patterns beckoned or when grief resurfaced unexpectedly. But now I met them with compassion, not fear. The love I had sought for so long, I learned to offer to myself, and in doing so, the world grew gentler, more forgiving. With every sunrise, I was reminded, new beginnings are always possible, no matter how many times you have to start over. The final gift I gave myself was the chance to live honestly, bravely, and with an open heart. I hope my story inspires others to choose themselves, not in anger or resentment, but in quiet faith, that healing is not only possible, but worth every step. And so, as the page turns and a new chapter begins, I invite you, wherever you are in your own story, to honor your boundaries, believe in your worth, and welcome the new beginnings waiting just beyond the horizon. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt left out, struggled to set boundaries, or found the courage to begin again, I hope you know you're not alone. Healing takes time, and every small step matters. If you found value in this journey, I invite you to share your own story in the comments below. What boundaries have you learned to set? What new beginnings are you hoping for? Your experience might be the encouragement someone else needs today. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories of resilience, growth, and second chances. And if there's someone in your life who might need this message, please consider sharing this video with them. Above all, remember, you are worthy of respect, love, and a